Hello, dear friend. Thank you for hanging out with a couple of multiples today. We are your hosts, Drew
and Garden System. We are a married couple that both have dissociative identity disorder, or DID.
Our lives are both ordinary and uniquely complex. Perhaps you were introduced to DID in a movie or TV show, or maybe you have been diagnosed with the disorder, or you are a therapist that wants to learn more about working with a client that has it.
Whatever the case may be, many people think having DID is like having an evil twin that takes control of your body to commit crimes, like seen in many movies such as Split and the 2005 Hide and Seek.
You are making a difference by choosing to listen to this podcast today because people with DID are not more inclined than any other person on this earth to commit crimes. Some parts exist to hold trauma, so other parts can function in everyday life. Each part plays a role in helping the system as a whole. You can help dispel myths about DID and help spread awareness by sharing this podcast with a friend or loved one. Please visit acoupleofmultiples.com.
In this episode, we are going to talk about the different roles that parts have in a dissociative system and the work we each had to do to achieve internal cooperation amongst all parts. Together, we can make a difference through education about the reality of how parts function.
Hello there, and thank you for tuning in to this riveting third episode with Drew
and Garden System,
a couple of multiples.
As you learned from our previous episodes, we are a married couple that were both diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or DID. Each of us have our own system of parts that work like a team to create the best life a couple of multiples could have.
Those of you with lived experience might be chuckling right now because, well, as you know, it takes a whole lot of work to get a team to be a team. Neither Garden System or I came with a cooperating, happy team of parts. We each had to do a lot of work to create internal cooperation and achieve co-consciousness. What is being co-conscious, one might ask? Well, we can't wait to tell you. But first, let's start with all things parts.
It is important to note that many different people use different terms to refer to parts. Parts just happens to be the word that both Drew and I use to describe ourselves. Other terms may include, and are certainly not limited to, alters, headmates, people, family, voices, selves, others, or insiders. Some people may even take offense to certain terms, so be sure to know what verbiage a person with a system prefers to use.
There are different types of parts one might have in their system, and each of these parts fulfills a role or roles in one's everyday life. First, we will go over the different types of parts, and then we will discuss the roles a part might have within the system.
Some common types of parts are littles, middles or tweens, teens, and adult parts. Littles are parts that generally identify being 0 to 9 years in age. Yes, that can include baby parts. Middles or tweens typically identify as being 10 to 12 years in age, while teens obviously are 13 years in age and up, and adult parts are age 18 and on as expected. There are many people living with DID that have systems with large numbers of child parts, which makes sense considering how parts were formed to hold trauma.
Yes, these are really the common ages of parts one might see in a system. But the age of parts is just one aspect. Parts also might identify as being a different gender than the body. This body of mine was born female, but I have several parts that identify as male.
Me too. Most of my parts identify as female, but we have 2 that identify as male. Parts in general might have different sexual orientations as well. That can create some difficult internal conflicts.
I'm laughing over here. Yeah, really big, migraine-producing, war-creating conflict.
Yes, we will get to discussing how we worked out some of those differences inside. Some other types of parts include those that don't identify as human. You see, the brain will produce whatever it thinks it needs to survive. For example, one of our parts is actually a Siberian tiger. Our brain reasoned that if we could shapeshift into a tiger, we would be able to protect ourselves. Obviously, there is no scenario where we would physically become a tiger, as the movie Split attempts to depict when the main character literally turns into a monster.
Right. Remember, these parts typically come about when a person is a child or teen. So animals, TV or book characters, or anything else that this young person is exposed to can be a basis for parts that their mind creates, sometimes in an attempt to feel powerful in what usually is a powerless situation. I have parts that are animals as well, cats and wolves in particular, and I also have parts that are part human and part animal. Well, really, they morph from human to animal and back again when needed. And then there's my dark phoenix part. That's technically a mythological creature, along with Raider, who is a mix between a unicorn and a pegasus, an alicorn, because I was obsessed with My Little Ponies. Some of these parts also believe they're either already dead or are immortal. Pretty handy when a child is fearing for their life.
So these types of parts are animals, mythological creatures, fictives, which are parts that come from fictional worlds in books, TV, or movies, and even factives. These are parts that are based on real-life people. We have even heard of people having parts like a tree or an inanimate object.
Yeah, or robots, ghosts, or angels. A part can look like or be anything.
One question that might come to mind is how these parts might typically appear when they front. From an outsider's perspective, you might not really see anything different. It is more of an internal experience. That being said, we have actually growled and hissed at people when our tiger was fronting. Most of the time, though, we are just aware of the tiger's presence internally. Like we can hear him growling inside our head.
Right. We, meaning people with DID, tend to have a very visual representation of our parts, especially as we learn more about them in our head and, quote, see and hear them internally. Before someone with DID develops internal communication and connection with their others, the experience might be described as loud, chaotic, or blurry.
The internal world, where we experience our parts, is something we will go into more depth in next week's episode. For us, that internal landscape includes the fictive realm where 3 of my parts identify coming from. For them, while they are in the internal world and in that fictive landscape, they have all their magical powers like in the story. But fronting for them is like traveling through a portal to our mundane world where they can't use their magic, but they still retain their personality traits. Leanna holds a position of power in the fictive world, and when she fronts, she still carries that air of confidence and authority when she shows up at work. She does find it highly annoying that she can't wave her hand to do magic when she's fronting, though.
Yes, these parts that are magical in our internal worlds find it highly annoying that they are somehow associated with this fallible human body on this despicable low-life planet Earth. Some of my parts still don't identify with this body because clearly it is not theirs because they'd rather not identify as being human at all.
This is that separateness that occurs. The body is not mine. That life is not mine. That did not happen to me. Our adult parts don't identify with the events that happened to us as a child. They have their own version or personal history that was probably created to cover up the trauma.
Right. These older teen or adult parts usually have amnesia for the trauma that happened in childhood, or at least don't remember certain parts of it that other parts are holding. This makes it bearable for that part or parts to go about daily life without the knowledge of all those memories. Me, Lizzie, who I've mentioned before in our previous 2 episodes, is my host part, which came about when I was in middle school when I was struggling to remember what was being taught in my classes and who my friends were. I decided to be the one out while at school to maintain continuity of memory. Me coming up with my own name wouldn't come till a few years later when the Disney Channel Lizzie McGuire series came out. Our body was 16 at the time, and I identified with the main character Lizzie in the series, particularly the animated cartoon bubbles that would pop up above her head depicting her thoughts and feelings of being a typical teenager. I wanted so badly to be a typical teenager. Identifying and essentially internalizing this TV character and naming myself after her came naturally to me and felt comforting because I wanted to fit in, just like Lizzie did in the TV series.
That's really how fictives form. You try to become that character because you believe that character is stronger and better than yourself. We became Leanna because she was confident and a leader. Now, obviously, we have those qualities within ourselves, or we wouldn't have developed Leanna at all. But they got wrapped up in her identity rather than, say, Victoria's identity. And that's how they started to take on different roles in our system.
Yes. Lizzie being out for a good portion of my day when I was a teenager is how she came into the role of being our host. When a system has a host, that might mean that this particular part spends more time out in the body than other parts, and therefore often makes more decisions in comparison to others. There are some systems out there that dislike the word host and feel the word has a negative connotation. My personal opinion is that I neither like or dislike the word. It has just been the word that DID literature has used to describe a part that is in charge, spends more time out than the others, and or might make more of the decisions. Some systems that identify with having a host part also say that this is their core part, or the part that holds most of who they are.
The idea of a core part really comes from some of the various theories and models about how one develops parts. We will go into more depth on theories and some of that terminology like core self in a future episode. There are some very strong opinions about some of these models for sure.
Even though I call Lizzie the host of my system, I don't see her as my core. She doesn't hold most of who I am as a whole. I feel like my core self was safely tucked away and went dormant when I was a baby. Having Lizzie out most of the time for so many years when I was growing up has been one drawback to how my system managed itself. It meant that only that small part of me was making decisions and had recall of most of the events in my life during that time period. However, the advantage of me doing this when I was a teen and young adult is that I was not experiencing switching constantly, which I argue kept me more stable and out of the hospital in comparison to a lot of systems I know. I absolutely did not get to know the other parts of myself during that time, and we were not working together as a team. In retrospect, I see that I developed an insane amount of anxiety while trying to do everything myself, which is why my therapist eventually led me to the idea of getting to know all the parts of me, to find out everyone's strengths and delegate tasks so I could feel less stress. Also, I was able to get to the root of our trauma experiences by getting to know the other parts of me, and we were able to process our traumas and heal as a whole.
Some systems have a host and some don't. We don't identify as having a host. We do have a leader, and we also have a part that is in charge of the system in many ways, but more about that part momentarily. Leanna doesn't front for the majority of the time in our body. There isn't any one part that is out more than any other part. Leanna is a leader, but she's not a dictator that makes decisions all on her own. The others tend to follow her due to her egalitarian way of taking everyone's thoughts and opinions into consideration.
Hey, are you calling me, Lizzie, a dictator?
No, just a little bit of a control freak, maybe.
Okay, people out there, if you could see my face right now, you'd see a very disdainful scowl spread all the way across it, pursed lips and all. There is no denying that maybe I do control things and want things to be a certain way, but that's not always bad.
It's not bad, but it can be exhausting. Leanna is all about delegating jobs to other parts. She's very good at saying, "Not my job."
Okay, so I'm controlling and you're lazy. Got it.
I'm efficient, thank you.
And I'm practically perfect in every way. Yes, thank you.
Just practically? Well, I guess we can't all be perfect in every way.
So you can see, folks, that the wars are not just internal with a couple of multiples living under one roof. Moving on.
Right. So the part I was talking about earlier about being in charge or in control is often called a gatekeeper, which is different from the leader. The leader is someone my parts choose to follow, while the gatekeeper can do things regardless of what others in the system think.
Care to elaborate? We get to talk about Jenny, don't we?
Yes, we do get to talk about Jenny. Some of you may be familiar with Jenny after reading Dr. Jamie Merritt's book, Dissociative Made Simple, or from simply following our Instagram page. We've mentioned her in previous episodes as well. Jenny is a little of ours and is just 4 years old. It took us a long time to figure out that Jenny was the gatekeeper and not Leanna. We wrongly assumed that Leanna had the controls since she was the leader. Leanna was just a decoy queen for Jenny. Gatekeepers have the ability to control which parts confront, whether or not they can speak, and even stop them from physically doing something.
So basically, you're saying you do have a dictator, and her name is Jenny, who is your gatekeeper, and she's 4 years old.
Guess who's scowling now? Don't get Keelara started about Jenny's gatekeeping powers.
We like giving each other a hard time. So yeah, some parts hold more power or have more sway in decisions than other parts and can literally affect who is allowed out in the system at any given time. And I'd venture to say this is usually about protecting the system.
We believe that all parts are protector parts in one way or another. Protector parts are exactly what it sounds like. Every job that a part does has the ultimate goal of protecting the system as a whole. Jenny is most definitely a protector part in that sense.
Some of you may be asking how a 4-year-old can protect your system. So how does she?
This is where I think it is important for people to understand that littles are not the same as external children in the world. Jenny is 4, but she has been 4 for like 37 years now. Jenny holds a lot of trauma memories. Jenny understands that bad things happen. She is keenly aware that Daisy lacks an appropriate sense of fear sometimes. In her eyes, others do not know when they should be afraid, but she does. So when she experiences a trigger that involves fear, she will step in to save the day, so to speak. Maybe she thinks Daisy is oversharing information, so she will take away our ability to speak. She may think the adults have taken on too many projects to complete, so she will force the system to rest and productivity will come to a screeching halt. The difficulty arises when she attempts to protect when there is no real threat.
Right. And it's hard to tell a gatekeeper, aka dictator, that their sense of fear in the present moment isn't really necessary. So what do you do then?
This is where internal compassion and cooperation comes in. It's also why Leanna is the leader and not Keelara. Keelara easily gets frustrated when this happens and always asks Leanna, "Why are we negotiating with a 4-year-old?" Leanna, on the other hand, recognizes the important role Jenny has played in our lives and does not believe in trying to wrestle away the role of gatekeeper away from Jenny. That would simply lead to chaos. Instead, she employs compassion and honors the extremely difficult challenges Jenny has already overcome for our whole system. Leanna says we need to understand that Jenny is so much more than 4 years old. All parts have strengths, even littles.
So Leanna tends to comfort Jenny in these situations?
In terms of support, yes, but Leanna is not a warm, cuddly part. She's not going to offer internal comfort in the way a caretaker would.
Which leads us into talking about parts that are internal caretakers or internal self-helpers. When I was just getting to know my system, when the body was a teenager, we had an older adult part we named Janet that we visualized taking care of the littles in our head. As we got older, nearing the age of how we used to picture Janet, we realized that our adult parts needed just as much comfort in everyday life, and we learned to be there for each other. Journey, who I described in our second episode as much more relaxed than me and easygoing, tends to step in and help me do tasks when I get overwhelmed. I had to come to a point where I was okay with her helping me, which gave up some of my control technically. It took me a while to trust her, but us working together as a team now is the most comforting way of being I've experienced up until this point.
Internal self-helpers show up in a lot of ways. Adults and littles alike often need help from others within the system. Having everyone learn to be a self-helper really helps with fostering internal cooperation. Leanna would often stress this to all of us. Creating a soothing caretaker for the littles is one way internal self-helpers make things easier for the adult parts who are trying to function in everyday life.
Right. My head tends to get loud when the littles are scared or fearful. Having parts there to comfort them makes things overall feel less chaotic, and sometimes that looks like me stopping for a moment and checking in with whoever's upset instead of ignoring them. I also have angel parts in my system that I used to think were actual external angels that came to help me, but now I look at them more as my higher self or maybe even spirit guides. Whatever the case, the angels in my system have been an amazing force in healing and bringing my system closer together instead of how my parts used to be, separated and alone. I have found that even the most rough persecutor type parts that take on the role of keeping other parts in line by hurting them, often in the same ways that the body was originally hurt, eventually return to the understanding that love is what is going to help the system. And internal self-helpers tend to be an example for everyone of how to love. I think it's often through a reliable therapeutic relationship where some of these damaged attachments from childhood are healed, and a system begins to be there for each other. Essentially, we learn to love ourselves.
Persecutor parts. We should talk about those. These parts can be very upsetting for a system. Talking about persecuting parts can potentially be triggering, so I think it's easy to vilify these parts. Persecutors develop in different ways and may evolve into other types of parts. We had a persecutor part that turned out not to be an actual part. He just simply vanished one day after resolving some trauma with EMDR.
Yes, persecutor parts are often emulated after real people in a child's life, like an internalized abuser, also known as an introject. But not all persecutor parts are introjects, and not all persecutor parts are emulated after a real person. These parts often hurt other parts in the system when they tell information about the abuse or trauma. The child was told not to tell what happened, so this part tries to essentially protect by not letting any parts tell.
In essence, a persecutor is also a protector in their own mind. It is difficult for the rest of the system to recognize this distorted way of protecting the system. Maisie, one of our team parts, used to be like this. She would often feel this need to punish the rest of the system in one way or another. Through therapy, Maisie has stopped a lot of those behaviors. Maisie's job inside was to protect the littles. If the adults were going to therapy and telling things that should not be told because she believed the littles would be hurt, then she would punish the adults. It's highly interesting to us that she is the protector of the littles because, like Leanna, she is not warm or cuddly by any means. She does not do internal comfort, but if someone outside tries to tell one of the littles what to do or hurts their feelings, she will front in a heartbeat.
Okay, well, there's one last type of part that we haven't mentioned here. Trigger warning here to talk about parts that take on the sexual aspect of one's life.
Please pause this episode if you need to and take care of all parts of yourselves before listening to this section. Talking about sexual aspects can be a difficult topic.
So, most of the time, there is a part or two in a system that takes charge of the sexual aspect of relationships. For my system, there were several parts of me that would be out when we were in sexual relationships with men, and there are different parts of my system out when we are in sexual relationships with women. Parts have their own sexual orientations and preferences, and having certain parts out in these types of situations keeps other parts that want to be removed from sexual encounters out of the picture. But it's not always as clear-cut and clean as it seems, and usually causes a lot of internal conflict. Who gets to choose who the system is with? What if one part wants to be sexual, but it triggers others in the system? So many things. So many things.
Sometimes sex is just something any adult part might participate in, and sometimes there are parts that only come out during sex. These parts can end up causing a lot of distress for the rest of the system, particularly the littles. Due to abuse experienced in childhood, some parts want nothing to do with sex, and some parts were made for sex.
We aren't going to really elaborate more than that in this episode. Perhaps in a future episode, it would be beneficial to talk in more depth about this topic, as it affects every system's life. But we did want to mention this type of part because it is important.
Right. Today's episode is more about going over all the various roles and types of alters. So far, we have covered hosts, leaders, gatekeepers, protectors, persecutors, introjects, internal self-helpers, animal parts, non-human parts, and the various age groups that might make up someone's system.
And now we're going to talk about the journeys we went through to get our system of parts to cooperate as a team and how we developed co-consciousness.
Having all these different parts with all these different jobs and roles can make for a very chaotic internal world. Everyone has their own goals. They are not talking to each other. They are not aware of each other, and they often end up fighting for control of the system. This leads to a lot of amnesia as well. One of the first things we had to really do was get to know each other.
And for me, getting to know my parts was at a point of desperation. I, Lizzie, was at my wit's end trying to go to work and stay employed. I was overwhelmed. My head was loud. I was having flashbacks and panic attacks, and I didn't know what was causing all the chaos.
It can be very confusing when you start to realize that you're not the only part occupying the body. There's a lot of denial and a lot of fear that you're just making this all up in your head. There's resistance to accepting and getting to know everyone inside. There's this fear of being crazy and that something is wrong with me. The more we tried to deny that we were a we, the more chaotic it got.
Noise, noise, noise. So much noise. The more I ignored my parts, the louder they got. So one day, I listened. And right, it wasn't easy to hear. Little parts stuck in trauma time, needing comfort and stability. Teen parts wanting to figure out who they are, how to fit in, and expressing their own opinions. And the realization that you must be the adult part, because apparently you need to hold down this job so you could pay rent, but not feeling even close to being the adult you need to be, too adult. It takes everything you have to try to sort through who is there, what they remember, and what they need and want.
Learning to listen is how you get to know everyone. It takes a lot of patience, as it takes time for parts to trust each other enough to make themselves known. We had to first learn who was there, how old they were, what their names were, and things that they liked and disliked. Then we started learning their strengths and their needs. It was not a quick nor an easy process to gather all of this information. We had to start by giving them a place to share about themselves. Using our journal to facilitate this early communication helped get some conversations going between parts.
I didn't use a journal right away, but I also used writing. When I first started trying to communicate with my parts and gather information, my therapist at the time asked my various parts if they would be willing to email her and asked their permission to share what they wrote with me during my sessions. Like Garden System said, it took a lot of time, which really equated to several years. Honestly, I still learn new stuff about the other parts of me, even to this day.
Being willing to listen and accept your parts goes a long way in establishing trust. Extending a little bit of trust at a time can help parts to open up and share. It is about building relationships between parts. Some parts will develop trust faster than other parts. Eventually, we didn't always have to use the journal to communicate with each other. We created spaces in our internal world where parts could meet and communicate. We haven't touched much on internal worlds yet, and that is coming soon, though, in a future episode.
Yes, creating a room or a place in the internal world where one visualizes their parts when they are not out in the body helps with the noise problem, because suddenly, instead of screaming and crying to try to get your attention, parts of yourself are talking to each other, perhaps around a visualized table or a few plush couches. One thing that helped get these internal conversations started was my therapist having parts draw a picture of themselves, self-portraits. My therapist would ask them to write what they liked to do or anything they were willing to share about themselves. Soon after, parts started sharing basic information about themselves, we started creating a map of our internal worlds. These were all ways to gather more information about our parts, system, and their possible roles in the past and roles or jobs they might take on now to help create a team where everyone is working together towards common goals. It sounds easier than it actually is.
Parts have to be willing to share information. And sometimes parts feel the need to keep secrets, or they have a distrust for other parts in the system. Jenny struggled with trusting the rest of us, and often would only talk to our therapist if she was certain none of us were listening. So we also had to work on building our internal relationships between parts in order to get to know them. It was a struggle to get Jenny to be willing to get close to anyone in our system. Eventually, she started building trust with Sadie. Sadie is one of our adult parts.
Journey and I went through a lengthy process to build trust and become allies. I used to despise Journey once I figured out that she was the one that used to empty our refrigerator at night. She didn't have a name at that time, so I rudely called her Karen because she was so annoying to me. Trust happened between her and I when my therapist had me listen in on a session where she explained the traumatic situations that led to her binging behavior. Suddenly, it made sense to me why she was eating so much. I gained compassion for her. My therapist encouraged us to spend time together in our internal world, and when we did, soon the wall that was between our two bedrooms in our internal house was taken down, and we have shared a room ever since. I don't call her Karen anymore. I call her by her chosen name, Journey. Journey and I are present together for most of our daily life now. She is the calm to my storm, and had I not taken the time to hear her story, I might have maintained my mistrustful disgust for her.
This reminds us a lot of two of our adult parts, Keelara and Victoria. The two of them did nothing but fight. It was like listening to a shouting match inside our head. They constantly were vying for control of external behaviors, which was very distressing to the system as a whole. The big change in their relationship occurred when Victoria was able to understand that all Keelara wanted was to be believed. No one was willing to believe anything that Keelara said. Victoria stopped arguing with her and started listening to her. The two of them ended up becoming best friends.
As time went on, each of us began to understand what each of our parts needed and wanted, making it possible to include these aspects into our daily lives.
Knowing what each of us needed did elicit compassion, and parts started meeting each other's needs. This included sharing time out in the body. This process was so impactful and important to our healing journey, and we want to share the process with all of you. We created a couple of different worksheets to help you begin the process of getting to know all of you and to start documenting how well everyone is getting along inside.
Please visit our website, acoupleofmultiples.com, and sign up for our mailing list to receive access to our resources page that includes these worksheets. They are completely free.
Another important aspect of fostering internal cooperation is making sure that all parts that wish get to have time fronting. Sharing the body and sharing experiences is pretty necessary for us.
So, how does one share time out in the body with their others? At first, it might seem like you're taking turns, and it might even feel like you're missing out when another part of yourself is out front talking and doing life. But over time, this changes as co-consciousness is practiced. Remaining aware of your others, talking to them, including them, and listening to them as you go about your day is how one practices being co-conscious, or living life as a team. One of the ways I first started practicing sharing time with my others was by deciding who was going to be out at what time of day, almost like creating a part schedule. After a while, this knowing when certain parts, quote, should be out becomes more spontaneous and develops a flow. But at first, at least for me, I almost had to schedule it.
One of the first things we learned to do was how to start watching when someone else was out. The part fronting would need to invite another to join them. Daisy likes to invite Jenny to come watch while Daisy plays. Jenny almost never plays herself, but she will come to observe the others. We started noticing the internal signs that are felt or sensed that let us know who is coming. Since Jenny is an observer, we have a tendency to feel her presence behind our eyes.
Great point. The idea of joining another while they are doing something is exactly the key, so you both are experiencing the thing together. It not only helps you build a relationship with each other, but you both will have knowledge of the thing you're participating in, instead of a wall of amnesia. Like Garden System said, figuring out who would like to spend time with who at first helps. We figured out that if Journey is present when I'm getting ready for work in the morning, I feel a lot less anxiety because Journey has such a laid-back, go-with-the-flow type of spirit. As you go along, you figure out who should team up to do certain things together. And after doing this a while, well, it literally starts feeling like you have a whole team behind you, and it's actually pretty comforting.
It takes a lot of work and effort to get there, though. When you are newly diagnosed, you don't quite know how to switch or how to get someone to come out. In the beginning of our journey with this diagnosis, Victoria somehow ended up fronting while at work. She didn't know anything about our job as a financial advisor and felt so lost. She ended up reaching out to our therapist in a panic because she didn't know where Leanna was. Our therapist tried to help by having her reach out to Leanna internally, but we just didn't have enough practice doing it at the time. That was a really rough day for Victoria.
Yeah, there's a lot of rough days before there's any flow or consistency, but continuing to practice and stay the course is key. Sometimes reaching out to your others can feel like trying to step through a brick wall. When we started to have awareness of our dark phoenix, also known as Feeny, it felt like there was a lot of resistance from her, and we eventually figured out that she was holding a lot of our trauma memories that she wasn't supposed to say anything about. So yeah, it's definitely not always warm hugs and group cheers, but eventually parts like Feeny can come around. In our case, she did, through a lot of therapy and processing with our therapist. Now she is one of our fiercest protectors.
For us, having all these parts is like having a big family inside our head, and we have to learn how to get along with them and share with them. There is a lot of conflict resolution and negotiation that has to happen to create peace and harmony inside. This requires a lot of internal listening and communicating. We would often have an internal meeting where all parts were invited to come together to talk. We did this for a long time each morning and would plan out who was going to work, when littles would come out to play, and what fun things we would do after work. And here is a tip. If you promise your littles that they get to play Minecraft before bed and they don't get to play, then they will create hell for you later. Keep your promises.
I'm dying over here. Yeah, even though I'm not there for Garden System's internal meetings, I know when someone didn't keep their promises. Talk about major meltdowns. Yes, internal meetings are essential, especially when big decisions need to be made or an event is coming up and you want to keep all of your parts in the loop. I think things feel less chaotic and loud internally when everyone gets a chance to express their opinions at these internal meetings and consensuses are reached together as a team. Not everyone always gets what they want, but compromises can be made, which tends to make parts a lot less angry.
There does have to be a lot of compromise. It's not just Leanna's life or Sadie's life. It is all of our life. We are at a point now where we highly value each and every one of us inside and recognize the contributions we all have made to help and protect the system. One exercise we have done, and I will say that it is pretty tough to do actually, is to take time to thank each and every part for something specific. For example, thank you, Leanna, for helping us stay employed. And then so on for each and every one inside.
I am so glad to have taken the time to figure out who inside of all of me is better than I am at doing the stuff I really dislike doing. It takes a lot of stress and anxiety off my shoulders, all of my others. It means I'm not doing life alone, and for that, I am very thankful. I know I extend my gratitude towards people in my life that help me, and doing the same internally for the parts of me really helps others know how much I appreciate them. When I tell them thank you, it can really be seen as a form of self-love because all of them make all of me.
This is especially important for all parts, even the ones that you may not like very much or that you wish would just go away. A lot of us hated Victoria for a long time. She was very judgmental and critical, and with her incredible resting bitch face, it caused some external problems. When her and Keelara started getting along, though, it changed everything. She still has a pretty good resting bitch face, but she is a lot less judgmental, and she channels that inner critic into action now. So instead of making snide internal remarks about the state of the house, for example, she'll just front and do the cleaning herself. It's kind of nice to have a part that likes to clean. We really ought to let her out more.
All jokes aside, every part is important, and all the headaches and hiccups along the way are worth building up a strong internal support system, so to speak. In summary, figuring out who is a part of your system, what their roles are, and how to function in harmony by becoming a team with walls down is the hard but worthwhile work of every multiple.
And in our next episode, we will go into depth about the internal worlds of dissociative systems. We will share about our own internal landscapes, how we discovered what was inside, and how we were able to shift and alter the inner space for the benefit of the system. Even if you are unable to see or access your internal world, you may still enjoy this episode, as iGarden System will talk about a time period when we could not see our own either.
We can't wait to bring you more content as all of us continue to spread awareness about DID. Thank you again for hanging out with a couple of multiples today. From your hosts, Drew
and Garden System.
Thank you for listening to A Couple of Multiples, the reality of dissociative identity disorder. This podcast is intended for educational purposes and is not a replacement for therapy.
Listening to this podcast does not constitute a therapeutic relationship with the hosts or any potential guest speakers.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. We would love to hear what you enjoyed the most.
You can visit our website at acoupleofmultiples.com for additional information and resources, and to also subscribe to our mailing list to receive future updates.
Remember, you matter and are loved for being all of yous.